The first time Clara nailed copper to the chimney, she did it with one eye swollen shut and a bloodied rag wrapped around her right hand. The wind on that December morning hadn't let up since dawn. It came screaming down from the ridgelines above Deer Hollow and threw the snow sideways hard enough to sting like gravel. Her cabin groaned as gusts hit the east wall, and the door, lashed shut from the inside with a strip of green willow, thumped and rattled like someone was pounding to be let in. She was up on the roof anyway, 3 kids inside, and not a drop of hot water between them. Her middle child, Ruthie, had a cough that sounded worse by the hour, and the baby had started to shiver, even when swaddled in 3 layers beside the hearth. Clara couldn't boil water fast enough. Not with that warped old kettle that took a full armful of wood just to steam lukewarm. Not with a stovepipe half choked in soot and throwing most of its heat out the chimney into the cursed sky. And not while the creek outside was frozen over with a layer so thick she had to break it with the back of an axe every morning just to get a sip. She didn't scream when she slipped the first time, just let out a sharp hiss through clenched teeth as her knee slammed the rough bark edge of the log wall, then dragged herself back up. Because no one in this valley was going to help, not after what they'd said, not after what she'd done. Widow fixin' to melt her roof now? Old Ben Palmer had spat 2 days ago when she carted home the copper. What's next? Build a lightning rod out of silver spoons? They'd all laughed. Because who the hell wraps copper coils around a chimney and calls it a water heater? The idea had come to Clara not in a dream, not in some flash of inspiration. It came the way most things came to women who had no help and no money. Slowly, painfully, and because everything else had failed. She'd seen the copper piping tossed behind the blacksmith's shed, scrap from a failed condenser rig, bent and dented in spots but still whole. She'd traded 2 hens for the lot of it, stripped her hands raw, straightening the coils, hammering the ends flat where needed, and wrapping the longest stretch tight around the stone chimney until it clung like a second skin. Then came the trick, sealing a bucket beneath the eave, feeding it with melted snow, running the copper end from it into the top coil, letting gravity and heat do the work. Water, ice warmed as it spiraled down along the chimney's rising heat, exiting into another bucket inside by the hearth. She didn't expect it to work the first night. She expected it to explode, maybe, or freeze solid. But when she dipped her hand into the lower bucket the next morning and steam kissed her fingers, actual rising steam, Clara started crying so hard she forgot the baby was still on her back. That same day, she boiled clothes clean for the first time in a month, washed the baby, cooked beans faster than ever, poured a cup of warm water into Ruthie's hands, and watched the girl's cracked knuckles smooth out like bark softening in spring. Word spread, not kindly, not yet. They'd seen the copper from the trail, seen it gleam like some cursed metal snake wrapping her chimney. The same men who'd once offered to help her heat things up when she first moved to the valley. Now they just called her mad. Palmer again, riding past with 2 others. Look at that thing. One spark hits that pipe. House'll light like a lantern. Another. Bet she thinks it's alchemy. Boil water with air. None of them dismounted. None of them asked if the kids were warm now. Clara didn't wave, didn't call out. She didn't need them to understand. That first week she fine-tuned it, found the pressure sweet spot by pinching the copper line halfway with a bent nail, letting the flow throttle just enough to heat fully without backing up, wrapped the chimney stones tighter where heat leaked, added a second coil, then a third, wrapping them parallel like a braid of fire, and with every tweak the water got hotter, stayed warm longer. She taught herself by mistake and necessity, and one night, after the baby had gone down without fuss, Ruthie snored softly, and her oldest, Jacob, was asleep with a warm stone under his feet. Clara finally sat still. The cabin had always been quiet, but now it wasn't the silence of fear or waiting. It was the quiet of warmth, the kind that seeps into your chest and makes your shoulders fall from your ears. She could feel heat even behind her knees. She dozed by the bucket just once, woke to the pop of wood and a cabin full of warm mist. That was the first time she let herself hope. The snowstorm came early, 2 feet in 12 hours. White so thick the valley trail vanished. The men down by Miller's Ford lost their horses to frostbite by dusk. Palmer's place lost its roof to wind that night. Clara's chimney, wrapped in that strange metal, never even cracked. In the morning, she opened her door, shoveled to the edge of the shed, and poured steam over the baby's cloth diapers to soften them before hanging them inside. That's when she heard the first knock, not from a neighbor, not a friendly one, from Sheriff McLennan. He stood awkward in the snow, chin dusted with frost, coat soaked to the elbows. His horse shivered behind him. The man who'd once scolded her for hauling water too close to the stove now had blue on his lips. "Miss Clara," he said after a moment, "we got sick folks at the chapel. Stove won't draw right. You got water? Hot water?" Clara looked past him, saw a wagon wheel buried half in snow, 2 kids huddled in the back. One had a scarf so stiff it cracked. She nodded once, wordless, stepped aside, and for the first time, someone else in that valley stepped into her cabin not to laugh or mock, but to ask how she'd done it. The door shut behind Sheriff McLennan with a gust of snow that spiraled and melted before it reached the hearth. He stood there, blinking at the warmth like a man stepping into a different world. Clara watched him quietly, her shoulders squared, her hands still dusted with ash. His eyes went to the chimney first, where the copper coils wound up like twin snakes into the ceiling, then over to the second bucket where a thin veil of steam shimmered above the surface. He didn't speak at first, just looked around at the walls, the children on the floor bundled in quilts, the way the heat filled the cabin like breath inside a chest. He took off his hat slowly, reverent almost. "I didn't believe 'em," he muttered. "When they said it worked." Clara turned to the stove and without a word lifted the ladle from the bucket and poured hot water into the tin basin on the table. Steam rose thick and fast. McLennan exhaled something like shame. The girl in his wagon, her name was Lacey, 10 years old, one of the preacher's nieces, had started seizing that morning. Her skin was cold as iron, her eyes rolled back when they shook her. They'd tried to warm her with firewood so damp it hissed and smoked, not burned. The old stove in the chapel gave no heat, just smoke, and their last pot had cracked trying to boil snow on an open flame. "Preacher said it was pneumonia," McLennan said, rubbing his jaw. "I think it's just cold. Plain old cold killing faster than bullets." Clara didn't nod, didn't answer. She reached into the crate near the hearth and pulled out a chipped enamel bowl, the edges singed black. She dipped it full from the warm bucket, then wrapped it in a torn feed sack to carry outside. "Bring her in," she said finally. Lacey was so light in his arms, McLennan said later. It felt like carrying a folded coat. Clara took one look and pulled the kettle from the fire, setting it near her feet on the floorboards. She used old towels, soaked them in the warmed water, and laid them over the girl's legs and chest. Not directly, never directly, she'd learned that with Ruthie, but layered, folded, pressed close. Then she wrapped her like a loaf of bread in blankets and set the girl near the hearth. Clara didn't speak as she worked. McLennan hovered, eyes darting between her and the girl. "You ever do this before?" he asked. "I got kids," she said, not looking up. He didn't ask again. By the time Lacey's fingers stopped curling and her lips flushed back toward pink, dusk had fallen. McLennan sat with his back against the far wall, not saying much, just watching the bucket and stove as if they were sacred objects. The heat inside the cabin stayed even, not too hot, never stifling, but deep, full, like the warmth didn't just press against your skin, it worked its way inward, slow and thorough. Clara had learned that once the coils got going, the heat didn't leak. The chimney held it like a bottle, and the copper carried it like a river. She'd thought once about cutting a second coil beneath the floorboards, running heat beneath where the children slept. But it was dangerous. She wasn't ready for that, not yet. Still, what she had worked, and McLennan knew it. When the sheriff left the next morning, he didn't thank her, not directly. But he took his hat off again, held it over his chest. "They're gonna ask," he said at the door, boots thudding once against the frame. "Others, maybe come see for themselves." Clara didn't answer, just reached to pull the door shut behind him, but he stopped it with one gloved hand. "You should know," he said, glancing back. "Palmer says it ain't safe, says it's sorcery, or close enough." "Then he shouldn't come close," Clara said, her voice flat. And this time, McLennan let the door close. It started slowly, one family, then another. Always at dusk, they'd come riding through the snow, horses slumped, dragging wagons too heavy with firewood that wouldn't light. They didn't ask to stay, not yet, but they'd bring their tin pails, bring jars, flasks, old kettles with rusted lids, and they'd offer things, buttons, dried beans, socks, even peppermint if they had it, to trade for one scoop of water warm enough to bathe or cook with. Clara never said yes. She just dipped the ladle in, handed them a jarful, and closed the door. But the next day, the line was longer. 3 men by noon, 6 by dark, and 1 woman in tears, holding out an empty canteen with a child strapped to her back. She began boiling in shifts. The original bucket couldn't keep up anymore, so she fixed a second pipe, then a third, ran one to the wash basin, another to a lidded barrel she sealed with beeswax. It wasn't pretty, it clanked and hissed sometimes, but it worked, and people started noticing more than the heat. They started seeing what else had changed. The snow melted around her chimney faster. The ice at her door didn't grow thick like theirs. Her children didn't wear mittens inside, and when she poured hot water onto frozen potatoes, it thawed them quick enough to cook without chipping a tooth. That's when the muttering began. "She's hoarding," one man said outside her fence. "She's trapping the heat somehow," another claimed. "Burning something strange in that stove," a third. "Copper, like that's not meant to be near fire." And soon, "She's boiling spirits. That's what keeps her warm." No one said it to her face, but Clara had seen this before, how envy dressed up like suspicion permission. Then someone tried to break in, 3 nights after the full moon. A sound at the wall, soft at first, then louder. Then a crowbar slipped between the log gaps near the back and popped a plank clean out. She didn't scream. She didn't wait. Clara grabbed the ash bucket, still full of steaming coals, and shoved it straight through the gap. A shout followed. Young, male, not from the valley. Then retreating footsteps, the crack of ice, and silence. She patched the hole with bark and nailed a sheet of flattened tin over it. Didn't tell anyone, didn't need to, because in the morning the boy's boot print was still frozen in the snow, clear as a church window, and every man who passed that day made sure not to look too long at her door. 1 week later the preacher came. Not McLennan, not a neighbor. Preacher Hemming himself, hat in hand, frost on his beard. Clara opened the door halfway, arms crossed. "I come asking," he said gently, "not demanding." She waited. "There's a boy up near the ridge. Fever's taken hold. Parents can't get the kettle to heat. Stove ain't throwing anything but smoke. No copper, no trick, no way to do what you've done." Still she said nothing. Hemming dropped his eyes. "They mocked you. I know they did. I might have too. But pride's no fire. And right now there's a boy could use your heat." Clara looked past him. The wind was coming down sharp again, snow drifting sideways. Then she stepped back. "Bring him," she said, "and bring your own bucket." The boy arrived on a sled. She laid him out by the hearth, as she had Lacey. This time she used flannels soaked in heated water, wrapped his feet in steaming cloths, fed him broth boiled fast and hot with water from the coil. By dawn, the fever broke. The preacher didn't say much, just prayed, low and soft, hands shaking as he dipped his own into the water and held them there. For the first time, Clara saw something more than shame in a visitor's face. She saw awe. That week she made the decision. She drew it out on the back of a flour sack. The design, how the copper wrapped, how gravity helped the water move, how pressure and heat danced together like partners at a barn dance. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. She wrote instructions with charcoal on the sack's edges, tied it in twine, and hung it on a post outside her fence with a tin sign above it. "If you want the heat, build it. Stop asking for mine." No signature, just that. By morning the sack was gone. By evening another man had left fresh nails at her door, and the valley began to change. By New Year's, 5 cabins had copper twisted around their chimneys. Not full coils, not like hers, but scraps, bent pipe from broken stills, flattened roofing nails, hammered in to hold pieces together, lengths of old brass mistaken for copper and used anyway. Some leaked, some hissed and groaned, and did nothing but melt snow faster off the roof. But the effort was there. The fear of doing what she'd done had given way to a colder, sharper fear. The fear of watching your child shiver beside a fire that wouldn't boil soup. One man, Mitch Barnell, a fur trader who once said Clara should remarry before her brain froze, came by to admit the truth. "My pipe split," he said, eyes down. "Scalded the dog, then froze shut. I don't know what I'm doing." Clara didn't lecture him. She didn't offer to fix it either. She gave him 2 lengths of spare copper, a wedge of beeswax, and told him to build a heat trap above the main coil before running water through it. "It'll slow the flow," she said. "Let the fire do the work." He nodded, embarrassed. That night, Mitch didn't knock again, but in the morning a ham was left at her door, wrapped in a flour sack and tied with string. Still, not everyone changed. Ben Palmer, for one, stayed as bitter as his frozen porch. He came stomping through the snow 2 weeks later, shouting from the fence line like a man owed something by the wind itself. His breath fogged thick around his beard, which hung with frost like moss from a dead tree. "You think you're some savior?" he called out. "Think you invented the flame?" Clara had just finished mopping the floor with boiled spruce water. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, steam rising behind her like a veil. "I think I kept my kids warm," she said. Palmer spat. "My stove burns fine." "Always has." She didn't argue, but she did glance at his gloves, wet through, and the ragged coat collar that fluttered like torn paper around his throat. "I can smell your chimney from here," she said. "It's burning pine soaked in snow melt." He looked like he might lunge then, might curse or throw something. Instead he turned and stomped off, muttering to himself. But that night, Clara saw him in the trees behind her cabin, watching, and the next morning someone had carved a crude spiral into her doorframe, like a snake, like a threat. She sanded it out with a rasp, didn't say a word. Ruthie's cough returned in early February, not a cold this time, something deeper. Her breaths wheezed, and her eyes drooped even when the hearth was full. Clara boiled herbs from the root cellar, steeped them in the copper-warmed water, and fed them to the girl by the spoonful. But still Ruthie worsened, so she tried something riskier. She took the longest length of copper she had left and coiled it tighter than the others, wrapping it not around the chimney but under the cradle frame itself. Set the baby's basket and Ruthie's cot over that spot, then lined the floor below with flat stones to hold the heat longer. She tested it twice, sitting barefoot for hours beside the spot until she could feel the warmth hold steady without burning through, and it worked. Ruthie slept through the night. No cough, no shiver, just breath, slow, even, and alive. The chapel burned down on the coldest night of the year. The roof caught first, then the walls. Nobody inside died, but they lost the food stores, the linens, the medical supplies. They said it started with a spark from the flue, said the stove hadn't drawn right for days. People came running through the snow, calling to Clara's cabin with wild eyes. "Do you have water? Anything hot? Boil cloth for burns, please." She didn't pause. She filled every kettle, every jar, every pot she had, and while the copper wound coils did their quiet work, she handed water out into the frozen dark like some frontier priestess, like heat itself had been hers to give. And that night, when the chapel was only cinders and smoke, 3 children and a midwife slept on Clara's floor beside the hearth. They didn't ask. She didn't tell them they could. They just came. Because now everyone knew. The 4th time someone tried to sabotage the coils, Clara caught them in the act. Young, barely 16, Palmer's oldest boy. She didn't shout, didn't raise a hand. She just stepped out of the cabin with her coat half fastened and looked him in the eye. "You cold?" she asked. He paused, hand still wrapped around a length of pulled copper. One nail already pried loose. His lip trembled. She nodded to the firewood stack. "Bring in an armful, then sit." He stared, stunned. She didn't say it twice, and by the end of that hour, he'd handed back the copper, tied the nail string around it himself, and left without a word. She never told his father. But 2 days later, Palmer rode past with his head low and didn't spit once in her direction. March thaw came late, and even then, it came in fits. Patches of mud emerged from snowbanks like wounds. The river cracked and hissed but didn't fully thaw. Some cabins collapsed inward from the weight of ice that had never softened. Others reeked of mildew and rot, but Clara's cabin stood clean, upright, dry at the floorboards, and warm in the rafters. Her copper coils, now burnished black in places, still hissed faintly as water rolled through them. Some joints had warped. She'd patched them with leather and beeswax, reinforced others with pine pitch. And though she'd given away nearly every extra pipe she had, the original coils still worked, and her children had not been sick once since Ruthie recovered. The widow's invention, they'd started calling it, whispered at first, then spoken aloud, and when the preacher himself asked if he could replicate her entire design in his new chapel rebuild, she agreed, but only on one condition. "You write it down," she told him, pressing charcoal and parchment into his hands. "Every step, every mistake I made, every one I didn't." He looked confused. "I can write it, but who would read it?" "Someone else, somewhere else," Clara said, her eyes hard. "Maybe not this valley, maybe not even this year, but someone." By spring, 2 more valleys heard of her. A boy came riding from east of the ridge, soaked and half-starved, with a rolled sketch of the copper system drawn in ink. He said his father had tried it, said it worked, said their livestock had water all winter, and their mother's joints stopped locking up in the frost. He gave Clara a satchel of dried apples in thanks, and said his mother called her a genius. Clara laughed, dry, half dismissing it. "I'm a mother," she said, "that's all." But still, she hung the boy's sketch beside the hearth, and when her youngest pointed at it, she said, "That's how we stayed warm." Not everyone forgave. Some couldn't. Ben Palmer never rebuilt the back of his cabin, let it sag instead, took to drinking stronger, spoke of how metal had no place on a woman's chimney, and how copper stole the soul from the flame. But even he, one night in late spring, left a bar of clean soap at her door, wrapped in brown paper, unmarked. Clara said nothing, just used it to scrub the floorboards by the cradle. When the next winter came, and it always did, Clara's chimney sang again. Steam rose, copper glinted, and her children, now another year taller, placed their socks on the coil hooks without asking. They knew the warmth would come. It always came now, not from magic, not from luck, but from hands that bled and burned and learned. Spring thaws meant nothing in the high valley if the ground never fully softened. By April, the upper trail to the ridge still held icy veins deep as a horse's hoof. Snowmelt ran in slick sheets down into the lower cabins, flooding root cellars and swamping half-finished sheds. What the freeze didn't claim, the thaw often ruined. Rot came next, hidden in the joints of beams, soaked into linseed floors, curling up under saddle blankets until the whole place smelled like cold death. But Clara's cabin didn't flood, and it didn't rot. The copper coils, tarnished now, darkened from months of smoke and ash, still worked each morning. The chimney still held heat, even with the stove on low. And even now, as the valley clawed its way back toward green, people came, not for water anymore, not always, but to ask, to learn, to copy what she'd done, and not because they were afraid of her anymore, but because they'd finally understood that they didn't have to be afraid of her at all. There were visitors she'd never seen before. A woman from Fort Clay who brought a sketchbook and 4 yards of canvas she said was meant to wrap her chimney against drafts. A young couple from Hillview who'd lost their child the winter before and now wanted to build the system right this time with real copper and valves, not hose and hope. One man even came from the mining pass, brought with him a bar of pure copper, traded from a smelter. He said word had spread down the trail, even to the traders. The widow's coil, they called it. Clara didn't correct them, but she showed him how to shape the metal anyway. Hammer flat, coil tight, leave expansion gaps. Always test the first run cold, she warned. Let the pipe breathe before the fire comes. He nodded like a child, took notes on the back of a whiskey label, and before he left, he gave Jacob a carving knife. For when he's old enough to whittle. Clara tucked it away in the pantry, far out of reach, but she didn't throw it away. Sheriff McLennan came back late in spring. He didn't knock this time, just stood at the fence line, hat in his hand again, eyes on the roof. The children were playing outside in bare feet, mud streaked to their knees. The water bucket by the door still steamed faintly from the morning's last draw. McLennan waited until Clara looked up. Then he spoke. "They want to name something after you." She frowned. "Who's they?" He shrugged. "The ones who stayed alive, I suppose." She didn't smile. "Not interested in plaques." He shifted his weight. "It ain't that. It's the preacher's rebuilding the chapel. He wants to call it Copper Light. Says it's fitting. Beacon in the cold. Your system's keeping 3 families warm through the thaw even now." She didn't answer right away. Then, "Call it what you want. Just tell them to get the angles right. The water won't move if it slopes wrong." McLennan smiled, just faintly, and for the first time, Clara thought he might actually understand something deeper than gratitude. The second winter came harder. An early freeze in October, storms by November. One night dropped to 35 below. Horses died standing up, eyes frozen. A woman 3 cabins over lost 3 toes while trying to chop firewood at dawn. Entire stretches of trail vanished under wind-packed snowdrifts that no man could cross without snowshoes and a week of rations. And yet the widow's cabin never lost its heat. The new coils she'd installed, hammered from the bar of copper the miner had brought, wrapped tighter than ever. She'd rerouted the intake bucket this time, raising it into the loft and feeding snowmelt through a canvas-wrapped chute. It kept better pressure, less freezing at night, water still warm enough by morning to make tea without flint. Her youngest could run barefoot on fur rugs. Ruthie never coughed, and Jacob, now tall enough to carry his own firewood, helped her patch the hearth with fresh mortar when the stone cracked from old strain. She had taught him how to keep the fire alive. Now she taught him how to share it. They came again that winter, the desperate, the sick, the shamefaced. But this time they came in daylight. They came with questions, not demands. And Clara, who had once been left to bury her husband alone and build a chimney with one arm bruised, did not turn them away. She brought them inside, showed them the seams, the welds, the pressure points. She taught them where to place the bucket, how to stagger the coil turn so heat spread evenly, how to smell for a leak before you could see it, and most of all, how to trust the work. "Don't pray to it," she told one young mother. "Copper ain't God, but it'll remember what you build into it. If you build it with care, it'll keep that memory, just like a quilt or a cradle." By the end of that second winter, nearly every cabin in the valley had some version of the widow's coil. Some still cracked, some still hissed, some burst in the night when the pipe froze wrong, but most didn't. Most held, and the death count that winter. Only one, an old man too proud to install it, who froze beside a hearth still filled with damp ash. Even Palmer wrapped his chimney in copper by February. Though he claimed it was just for insulation, no one corrected him. But they all noticed that he never spat toward Clara's fence again. The preacher's new chapel opened with 12 lanterns glowing and a copper chimney running up its back wall like a spine. He didn't call it Copper Light after all, he called it Heat of Mercy. And the first name he mentioned in the dedication was not God's, it was Clara's. She didn't go, but she heard about it from Ruthie, who'd gone with Jacob to carry firewood. "They lit the copper," Ruthie said wide-eyed. "The pipe sang. It made a sound, like music, but soft." Clara nodded. "Steam always hums when it's sealed tight." "No," Ruthie said, shaking her head. "It was different, like voices." Clara didn't say anything, but that night, she tightened the last coil on their own chimney with hands that didn't shake anymore. One spring, a man came all the way from Salt Lake City, brought paper and ink, said he was from a Society of Mechanical Science, whatever that meant. He asked for permission to write about the system, to make a diagram, to send it to a paper. Clara looked him up and down. Did you come through the valley? I did, he said. Did you stay warm? I did. Then you already have permission. He looked confused. She pointed at the copper pipe steaming behind him. It's written already, she said. He left with more than he'd come for. By the time Clara turned 40, the copper was no longer shiny. It had dulled to a dark bronze along the chimney, mottled with soot and memory. Some called it ugly. Others said it looked like tree bark, organic, natural, belonging. But to Clara it was simply quiet, the color of something that had endured, the color of usefulness, proven again and again across seasons, storms, and the silence of bitter nights when warmth was the only prayer. It was early fall again now, and the nights had begun to whisper winter's return. Chickens huddled in their roosts longer. The mornings held frost thick enough to crack under boots. Clara had already patched the roof twice, not because it leaked, she wouldn't allow that, but because after all these years, her home had become more than shelter. It had become symbol, and symbols could not rot. Jacob was 12 now. He was taller than the stove, strong in the wrists, and calm in the shoulders. He knew how to carry firewood without spilling it. He knew when the kettle was ready just by how the steam curled from the spout. He could wrap copper without kinking it, and he could solder joints using coals and a hollowed deer horn packed with resin. He didn't call it the widow's coil. To him, it was just Mama's chimney, and he'd begun teaching it to others. Ruthie helped too. She was quieter, thoughtful. She'd sketch the system for curious newcomers who couldn't grasp the turns and pressure points. She'd note how certain bends changed the speed of heat transfer, how lower coils had to be longer, or else they wouldn't keep warm past sunset. The baby, no longer a baby, mostly watched, but he watched closely, and Clara watched them all. Her home had not only survived, it had seeded something. One morning, a wagon came up from the low trail, drawn by a shaggy mule, sun-bleached boards creaking. It carried a man in spectacles and a young woman with braided hair tucked under a canvas bonnet. They were city folk, Salt Lake, maybe, or beyond. They smelled like books and coal smoke. But what caught Clara's attention was the long wooden crate tied behind the wagon. When the man stepped down, he bowed. Actual bowing. Strange to see. "Ma'am," he said, "we've brought your request." Clara frowned. "I didn't request anything." The girl smiled softly. "The school in Grafton sent it. A thank you," they said. "Your design heated the winter house there, saved dozens, so they built this for you." She pulled the canvas off the crate. Inside was a stove, not the old kind. This one was custom built, squat and heavy, with thick iron walls and a round chamber on the back, specifically designed to coil copper pipe around it. "It burns longer," the girl explained. "Hotter too, and the back can store extra water for slow boil. They call it the hollow fire." Clara didn't speak for a moment. Then she stepped forward, ran her hand along the edge. It was warm already, preheated with bricks packed around its base in the wagon. She looked up at the girl. "You built this?" The girl hesitated. "We did, but you started it, all of it." Jacob helped carry it inside. They installed it in silence. By that winter, Clara's cabin glowed like a lantern. The new stove kept water hot for hours. Steam lines ran from it to a small tin basin she set up outside as a hand-washing station. Children from nearby cabins came to warm their hands after hauling hay. Men brought pipes to solder. Women brought jars to sterilize for canning even in January. The cabin had become a hearth, not just for her family, but for the valley. She never asked for payment, but her pantry stayed full. Her roof stayed patched. Her firewood never ran low. One day, she found a wrapped bar of soap again on her porch, and beneath it, a note, charcoal scratched and barely legible. "For the heat we have now, for the one who burned first." No name. She didn't need one. Years later, the valley finally named its town. The postal riders had grown tired of the place up past Ridge Hollow and that stretch with all the steam pipes, so they called it Coil Ridge. And while not everyone knew why, those who did didn't laugh anymore. They just nodded when the name was spoken, because it wasn't just about copper. It was about what copper became when a woman, left to the cold and grief and silence, refused to freeze, when she learned how to make heat out of something more than fire, out of grit, out of will, out of love. Clara never left the cabin. She added to it a second room, a better root cellar, a sun-warmed lean-to for washing and drying. But the heart of the house, the chimney wrapped in tarnished copper, the coil lines that hissed like whispers in winter, that never changed. And even when she was too old to shape the pipe herself, she still taught. Her children taught, and their children after, not just how to bend copper, but how to survive what others mock, how to take what no one understands and make it essential, how to turn scorn into steam. And on the coldest nights, long after the fire had dimmed, the wind howled, and snow swallowed the fences, the neighbors would say that you could still see it, a glow from her chimney, faint, golden, winding up through the frost like something alive. Not magic, not a miracle, just the warmth of a widow who refused to let the cold have her children, and a coil of copper that never stopped carrying fire.